There's a photograph that circulates among genealogy forums late at night. It shows 7 men standing in front of a farmhouse in rural Kentucky, their shirts removed, their backs to the camera. The image is from 1953. What makes people stop scrolling isn't the grainy quality or the faded sepia tone, it's what's visible on every single one of their spines. A marking, identical, precise, running from the base of the skull down to the tailbone. The men are all Elridges, father and sons. And according to the only surviving family member willing to speak, that mark appeared on every male child born into that bloodline for over 100 years. It wasn't a birthmark. It wasn't a scar. And when doctors finally examined it in 1968, they found something that shouldn't have been possible. This is that story. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Elridge family first appeared in the American records in 1872, when a man named Josiah Elridge purchased 300 acres of bottomland along the Cumberland River in southeastern Kentucky. There was nothing remarkable about the transaction itself. The land was cheap, isolated, and prone to flooding. Josiah paid in cash. He arrived alone. According to the deed, he listed no next of kin, no previous address, no occupation. Within 2 years, he'd built a house, cleared the fields, and married a local woman named Sarah Cobb, the daughter of a tobacco farmer. Their first son, Thomas, was born in 1875, and that's when the whispering started. The midwife who delivered the child told her sister, who told the reverend's wife, who eventually told half the county. The baby had been born with a mark, not the kind you'd expect from forceps or a difficult birth. This was something else, a line, dark, raised slightly from the skin. It ran the entire length of the infant's spine, perfectly straight, perfectly centered. The midwife said it looked like it had been drawn with ink, but when she tried to wipe it away, thinking it was residue from the womb, it didn't move. It was part of him. Sarah Elridge reportedly wept for 3 days. Josiah said nothing. He wrapped the baby, paid the midwife twice her fee, and told her she'd imagined it. But she hadn't, and neither had the doctor who came by the following week. In his personal journal, which was donated to the County Historical Society in 1994, he wrote, "Examined the Elridge infant. Spine presents with pigmented line, origin unknown, symmetry unnatural, mother hysterical, father uncooperative, recommended observation." There was no follow-up entry. Thomas Elridge grew up healthy. The mark remained, and when he turned 23 and fathered his own son, the child came out marked in exactly the same way. Then that son had sons, and they were marked, every single one. For 3 generations, the Elridge men carried that line down their backs like a signature. The daughters were born unmarked. The family stopped inviting doctors to the births. They stopped going to church. By the time the 1920s arrived, the Elridges had become what locals called kept people. They farmed, they sold crops, but they didn't socialize. They didn't marry outside the county, and no one, not even the neighbors, ever saw the men without shirts. In 1937, a man named Carl Hodge became the first outsider to document what he'd seen. Hodge was a traveling photographer working for the Farm Security Administration, part of Roosevelt's New Deal program to capture rural American life during the Depression. He'd been driving through Appalachia, photographing sharecroppers and coal towns, when his vehicle broke down outside the Elridge property. He walked up to the house looking for help. What he found, he later said, made him wish he'd walked the other direction. 3 Elridge men were working in the field that afternoon, shirts off in the August heat. Hodge saw their backs from maybe 30 yards away. In his personal notes, archived at the Library of Congress, he wrote, "I thought at first they'd been whipped. The lines were so uniform I assumed scarification, ritual punishment, perhaps religious. But as I approached, I realized the marks were too perfect, too identical, and they weren't scars. They had depth, texture, almost like a seam." He raised his camera. One of the men turned. Hodge said the look on his face wasn't anger, it was terror. Pure, silent terror. He lowered the camera. He never took the shot. He got his car fixed in the next town and left the county that same day. But he wrote about it. over and over, in letters to his brother, in journal entries that spanned decades. He called it the line that shouldn't exist. Carl Hodge died in 1981. In his final letter to his brother, written just weeks before a stroke took him, he said, "I've spent 40 years trying to convince myself I saw something ordinary that day. A tattoo, a deformity. But I didn't. I saw something that was placed there, deliberately, before birth. And I've never stopped wondering who or what did the placing." By the 1940s, the Elridge family had grown. Josiah's great-grandsons now worked the land. There were 8 of them, all marked, all silent about it. The family had developed a reputation. Not violent, not criminal, just wrong. People in town said the Elridges had bad blood, that something had gotten into the line generations back and never left. Women wouldn't marry into the family unless they were desperate or didn't know better. The few who did rarely spoke about what happened behind closed doors. One woman, Patricia Ann Morland, who married an Elridge in 1949, told her sister years later that her husband wouldn't let her touch his back, ever. He slept on his stomach, he bathed alone, and when their son was born in 1951 with that same dark line running down his tiny spine, her husband looked at the baby and said, "He's ours now. Not he's mine, not he's healthy, he's ours," like the child had been claimed by something larger than the family itself. Patricia left in 1954. She took her daughter, she left the son. In her divorce filing, she cited irreconcilable differences and fears for personal safety. The son, named Daniel, grew up on the farm. He never married, he never left. And in 1998, he became the only living Elridge willing to speak. Daniel Elridge was 71 years old when a journalist named Rebecca Marsh found him. Marsh was researching Appalachian folklore for a book on generational curses and family superstitions. She'd heard rumors about the Elridges through a contact at the Kentucky Historical Society. Most people she spoke to told her the family was gone, died out, the farm abandoned, but property records showed Daniel still lived there, alone. She drove out on a gray morning in October. The house was still standing, barely. Daniel answered the door with a hunting rifle in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Marsh said later that his eyes looked like someone who'd been waiting his whole life for someone to finally ask the right questions. They spoke for 6 hours. Daniel recorded the conversation himself. He said he wanted proof that he'd told the truth before he died. The tape was donated to the University of Kentucky's Appalachian Archives in 2003, after Daniel passed from heart failure. On it, his voice is steady, tired, resigned. He begins by saying, "You want to know about the mark. Everyone who comes here wants to know about the mark. So I'll tell you. But you won't believe me. No one ever does." Daniel explained that the mark wasn't just visual, it had weight. He said that's the part people never understood. You could feel it, from the inside. Like something was pressed against your spine from the other side of your skin. He said every Elridge man he'd ever known described the same sensation. A presence, not painful, not constant, but there, always there, watching, waiting. He said his father told him it got worse as you aged, that by the time you were 50, 60 years old, you could feel it moving, slowly, adjusting, like something alive rearranging itself along the bones of your back. Marsh asked him if he'd ever seen a doctor. He laughed. A bitter, hollow sound. He said his grandfather had tried once. Back in 1968, the old man had finally broken down and gone to a clinic in Lexington. He let them photograph it, x-ray it, take samples. Daniel said the doctors were fascinated at first, then confused, then silent. They sent the samples to a lab. 3 weeks later, 2 men in suits showed up at the farm. They weren't doctors. They didn't say who they were. They asked questions about the family, about how far back the marks went, about whether anyone else outside the bloodline had ever developed one. Daniel's grandfather told them no. The men took all the medical records. They paid him $500 in cash. They told him not to go back to that clinic. He never did. Daniel said he still had the photographs, the x-rays. His grandfather kept them hidden in a lockbox, buried under the barn. After the old man died in 1976, Daniel dug them up. He showed them to Marsh. She described them in her notes. The x-rays showed the spine, normal bone structure. But running parallel to it, embedded in the tissue, was a thin line of something dense, something that showed up white on the film, like metal or calcified bone. But it wasn't bone. The edges were too smooth, too deliberate. It looked, Marsh wrote, like a wire, or a root, something foreign that had grown into him before he was born. Daniel told Marsh something else that day, something he said his father made him swear never to repeat. But his father was dead, his uncles were dead, he was the last one, and he was tired of carrying it alone. He said the family had a story, passed down verbally, never written, never shared outside the bloodline. It went back to Josiah, the first Elridge, the man who appeared in 1872 with no history and too much cash. According to the story, Josiah hadn't come from another state. He'd come from another family, a family that had been part of something Daniel called the old arrangements. He didn't know what that meant exactly. His father hadn't known either. But the story said there were families, scattered across the South, who'd made agreements generations before the Civil War. Agreements with things that lived in the land, not native spirits, not Christian devils, something older, something that had been here long before anyone gave it a name. These families offered something in exchange for prosperity, for protection, for land that produced when others failed, and what they offered was lineage, blood, the promise that every generation would carry a piece of whatever they'd made the bargain with. Josiah's family had been one of those families. But Josiah tried to run. He changed his name. He moved to Kentucky. He thought distance would break the chain. It didn't. When his first son was born with the mark, Josiah knew. He'd brought it with him, and it wasn't going to let go. Daniel said his grandfather once told him that Josiah had tried to cut the mark off his son when the boy was 3 years old. Took a knife to the child's back. The blade wouldn't go deep enough. Every time Josiah pressed, the line seemed to sink further into the flesh, like it was retreating into the bone itself. The boy screamed. Sarah pulled Josiah off. They never spoke of it again. But the scar from the attempt was still visible when Thomas Elridge grew up. A faint crosshatch over the mark. Proof that someone had tried to remove it, and failed. Marsh asked Daniel if he believed the story, if he really thought his family had been bound to something inhuman. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what I believe, but I know what I've felt, and I know that every man in my family who lived past 50 started talking to himself, or to something. My father did it. My uncles did it. They'd be out in the field, alone, and you'd hear them speaking, low, like they were having a conversation, and when you'd get close, they'd stop, but their eyes—" He paused. Their eyes looked like they were still listening. Daniel admitted he'd started doing it too, a few years back. He'd be in the house, or out by the barn, and he'd feel the urge to speak, not to God, not to himself, to the mark. And sometimes, he said, it felt like it answered. Not with words, with sensations. A warmth, a tightening, a sense of approval or disapproval. He said it was like living with a second nervous system, one that wasn't entirely his own. Marsh asked him the question that had been building since the interview started. She asked if the mark had a purpose, if it did something. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, he turned around, and he lifted his shirt. Marsh described what she saw in her notes with clinical precision, as if keeping her language sterile would make it easier to process. The mark ran from the base of Daniel's skull to just above his tailbone. It was darker than she'd expected. Not black, not brown, something in between. A deep, bruised purple that looked almost wet in the light. But it wasn't smooth. That's what unsettled her most. It had texture, ridges, like scar tissue, but organized, symmetrical. She said it looked like something had been sewn into his spine from the inside and the skin had healed over it imperfectly. There were nodules, small raised points along the line, evenly spaced. 7 of them. She counted. Daniel didn't say anything while she looked. He just stood there, his back to her, his shoulders tense. After maybe 30 seconds, he lowered his shirt and sat back down. He told her the nodules had appeared when he turned 40. His father had them too. So did his uncles. They called them the markers. No one knew what they were for. But Daniel said that when he pressed on them, even lightly, he could feel a response somewhere else in his body. Pressing the top one made his teeth ache. The one in the middle made his heart skip. The lowest one made his legs go numb for a few seconds. He said it was like his entire body was wired to that line. Like the mark wasn't just on him, it was in him. Controlling something fundamental. Marsh asked if he'd ever tried to have it removed. Surgically. Daniel shook his head. He said his uncle tried in 1983. Went to a doctor in Ohio. Told him it was a cyst. A malformation. The doctor agreed to operate. They put him under. Made the first incision. And according to the surgical report, which Daniel had a copy of, the moment the scalpel touched the mark, the patient's vitals crashed. Heart rate dropped to 30. Blood pressure bottomed out. They pulled back, closed him up, woke him up. He was fine. The doctor refused to try again, told him the tissue was neurologically integrated and that removing it might cause paralysis or death. The uncle lived another 12 years. The mark never changed. Daniel leaned forward then. His voice dropped. He said there was one more thing. The reason he'd agreed to talk. The reason he wanted it on record. He said that 2 weeks before his father died in 1991, the old man woke up in the middle of the night screaming. Daniel ran to his room. His father was sitting up in bed, clawing at his back, trying to reach the mark. He was shouting something in a language Daniel didn't recognize. Not English, not any language Daniel had ever heard. It sounded old, guttural. His father's eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing the room. He was seeing something else. Somewhere else. Daniel grabbed him, shook him. His father finally snapped out of it. He looked at Daniel with absolute clarity and said, "It's calling us back. All of us. It wants to know if the line held." Then he laid back down. He died 3 days later in his sleep. Peaceful. Quiet. Like nothing had happened. Daniel said he didn't know what his father meant, but he'd started having the dreams too. Dreams, where he's standing in a forest that doesn't exist anymore, where the trees are too tall and the ground is soft like flesh, and there's something behind him, always behind him. He can't turn around to see it, but he knows it's tracing the line on his back with something sharp, and it's counting, checking, making sure the mark is still intact. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Rebecca Marsh left the Elridge farm that day with more questions than answers. She tried to follow up. She sent letters. She called. Daniel never responded. In 2001, she drove back out to the property. The house was empty. The windows were broken. The fields had gone wild. Neighbors said Daniel had been found dead in his bedroom 6 months earlier. Natural causes. Heart failure. He was 74. The county took possession of the land. There was no will. No next of kin. The Elridge line, at least the documented part of it, had ended, but Marsh couldn't let it go. She spent the next 2 years tracking down anyone who'd had contact with the family. She found Patricia Ann Moreland, Daniel's mother, living in a nursing home in Tennessee. Patricia was 86 and her memory was failing, but when Marsh mentioned the mark, the old woman's face changed. She grabbed Marsh's wrist. She said, "You've seen it. You've seen what they carry." Marsh said yes. Patricia closed her eyes. She said she tried to forget, tried to convince herself it was just a birthmark, just a strange family trait, but she knew better. She said the night her son was born, she looked at that line on his back and felt something looking back at her. Not through the baby's eyes, through the mark itself, like it had awareness, like it was pleased. Patricia said she'd asked her husband once, late at night, what the mark really was. He'd been drinking. He told her things he shouldn't have. He said his grandfather told him the mark was a claim, that the family didn't belong to themselves anymore. They belonged to what was in the ground, what had always been in the ground. He said the land remembers agreements. That soil has memory, and the Elridges had roots that went deeper than anyone understood. Patricia asked him what would happen if the family died out, if there were no more sons to carry the mark. He looked at her like she'd said something obscene. He said, "It won't let that happen. It'll find another branch, another name. The line doesn't end, it just moves." Marsh asked Patricia if she thought there were others, other families, other marks. Patricia nodded slowly. She said her husband mentioned names once. Families in Virginia, in Carolina, in Tennessee. She couldn't remember them all, but she remembered him saying they all had something. A sign, a trait that passed down and couldn't be bred out. She said he called them the bound families, the ones who'd traded too much for too little and couldn't buy their way back out. After Patricia died in 2004, Marsh tried to publish her findings. She wrote articles. She submitted them to folklore journals, historical societies, medical publications. Every single one was rejected, not because the story wasn't interesting, but because no one could verify it. The X-rays Daniel had shown her were gone. The lockbox was never found. The tape recording existed, but without physical evidence. It was just a story, a disturbing story, but still just a story. Marsh's book was eventually published by a small press in 2009. It sold fewer than 800 copies. Most reviewers dismissed it as Appalachian Gothic fiction, a well-researched hoax. But Marsh kept a folder. Emails, letters from readers, people who said they'd heard similar stories from their own families. A man in North Carolina said his great-uncle had a mark on his chest, born with it, shaped like a handprint. A woman in Georgia said her grandfather's family all had extra vertebrae, one too many, perfectly formed but unexplainable. They weren't Elridges. They weren't related. But the pattern was there. Marks, traits, things that shouldn't be inherited but were, things that felt intentional. Marsh died in 2017. Her research was donated to the University of Kentucky. Most of it remains unexamined. But the tape is there. Daniel's voice is there. And if you listen closely, near the end of the recording, after Marsh has turned off the main microphone, you can hear something else. A faint sound in the background, rhythmic, like breathing. But not from Daniel, from somewhere else in the room. Or something else. In 2019, a genealogist named Martin Cole was conducting research for a client tracing their Appalachian roots. He came across the Elridge name in a database of land records and started following the thread backward. What he found wasn't what he expected. Josiah Elridge hadn't appeared out of nowhere in 1872. He'd changed his name. His original surname was Eldridge, with a D. And the Elridge family had a documented history going back to 1746, when they'd first settled in the Virginia Piedmont. They'd been landowners, prosperous, influential in their county. And then, in 1871, the entire family vanished from the records. All at once. No deaths recorded, no land sales, no migration documents. They simply stopped existing on paper. Except for one son, Josiah, who reappeared a year later in Kentucky with a new spelling and a new life. Cole found something else. A letter, archived in the Virginia Historical Society, written in 1870 by a minister named Reverend Howard Pitts. In it, Pitts describes visiting the Eldridge estate to perform a baptism. He writes, "I was received with coldness and escorted to a room where I was not permitted to leave. The child was brought to me, and I performed the rite, as requested. But I confess I hesitated. The infant bore upon its body a mark of such peculiar nature that I questioned whether it was fit for baptism at all. The family assured me it was a natural occurrence, but natural things do not look drawn by compass and rule. I left that house with the conviction that I had blessed something that ought not to have been blessed. I have prayed on this matter every night since. I do not believe my prayers are heard. There was no follow-up. Pitts died 6 months later, cause of death listed as drowning. He'd been found face down in a creek on his own property. The water was 8 inches deep. Cole kept digging. He found records of 3 other families in the Virginia area with similar patterns. Families who'd been prominent in the 1700s, who'd experienced unusual prosperity, and who'd all produced sons with documented physical anomalies that were never fully described in medical records, but were mentioned repeatedly in personal letters and diaries. One family called it the keeper's touch. Another referred to it as the inheritance mark. A third simply called it the proof. All 3 families had branches that disappeared from records in the mid-1800s, and all 3 had descendants who resurfaced in different states under slightly altered names. Cole contacted a geneticist. He wanted to know if there was any scientific basis for a physical trait like the Elridge mark to be passed down so consistently through only male children. The geneticist told him that heritable physical traits don't work that way. Birthmarks aren't genetic, skin pigmentation patterns aren't locked to a single sex, and structural abnormalities in tissue formation would present inconsistently across generations, not identically. What Cole was describing was biologically implausible. Unless, the geneticist added, it wasn't a natural trait at all. Unless it was something introduced, artificially, deliberately. But that would require a level of genetic manipulation that didn't exist in the 1700s, or in the 1800s, or even in the 20th century until very recently. Cole's research was never completed. In 2021, his laptop was stolen from his car. The backup drive was corrupted. He tried to reconstruct his findings from memory and surviving notes, but he said the connections weren't as clear the second time. He eventually moved on to other projects. But in an interview posted on a genealogy podcast in 2023, he said something that stayed with listeners. He said, "I think there are families out there right now, living normal lives, who have no idea what's in their blood, what was put there, and I think whatever did the putting is patient. It doesn't need them to know. It just needs them to keep having children, to keep passing it forward, because eventually, when enough time has passed, and enough lines have been seeded, it'll be ready to collect." The Elridge farm was sold at auction in 2007. A developer bought it. Plans were made to clear the land and build housing, but the project stalled. Permits were delayed. Financing fell through. The land sits empty now, overgrown. Locals say no one goes out there, not because it's dangerous, but because it doesn't feel right. Because when you stand in those fields, especially near where the old house used to be, you get the sense that you're being measured, evaluated, like something beneath the soil is deciding whether you're worth marking too. The photograph from 1953 still circulates. 7 men, 7 backs, 7 identical marks. People enhance it, zoom in, try to see details, and the more you look, the more it seems like the marks are slightly different in each man. Not in shape, but in depth, in darkness, like they're at different stages of the same process. Ripening, maturing, preparing for something that hasn't happened yet. There are no Elridges left. Not with that name. Not in Kentucky. But the geneticist was right about one thing. Traits like that don't just disappear. They hide. They wait. They move through bloodlines like water through roots, invisible until they surface again. And when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning and you feel that strange pressure on your back, that sensation like something is pressed against your spine from the inside, you have to ask yourself, how far back does your family really go? And what did they agree to when no one was writing it down? Some inheritances can't be refused, some marks can't be scrubbed away, and some families were never meant to end. They were only meant to spread. Thank you for watching. If this story unsettled you the way it unsettled me, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think the mark really was. And as always, stay curious, stay questioning. Because the truth is rarely what we're told it is. And history has a way of keeping its darkest secrets buried just beneath the surface. Until someone like you comes along and starts digging. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.